So in this video we'll be looking at classes and objects. Classes and objects are a key part of most programming languages, including Python. So a class is basically a template or a blueprint used to create objects, and an object is an instance of a class. So let's say we want to write a system to manage employees at a company. Each employee can be generalized with an employee class. So let's implement this class. To define a class, we use the class keyword, and the Python naming standard for a class is camel case, so we'll do a capital E, employee, and in there let's declare a class attribute, so employee count, and we'll give that default value of 0. A variable declared here will be shared across all instances of that class, so all objects will have a reference to employee count. Now when we create an object, an initializer function is called. So let's define this initializer. So we do def and then double underscore, so dunder init and then double underscore. So this is the init method, also known as a class constructor or an initializer. Because this function will be creating an instance of a class, we'll also need to give a reference to that instance. So this self is the keyword for a reference to the instance. And let's say when we create a new employee object, we want to pass it the first name and last name as mandatory fields. So in this method we want to set the employee's first name to be the first name that was passed when initializing the object, and we also want to do that with the last name. So what other attributes will an employee have? So we can say salary, and we'll give it a default none for now. Let's say we can pass that in as well, so salary none. So if they don't pass it in, it'll equal none. And every time we create a new employee object, we also want to increment the employee count. Now we can access the employee count using employee class name, so employee count, and then we increment that by 1 like that. Now what other functionality may an employee object have? Let's say we want to see all the employee details, so we can have a function for that, so def display details, and because we want to display the details of that particular object, we have to give it a reference to that instance, and in there let's create the details string. So we have the details string, which will give the name, and then we're passing the first name, last name, and then the salary, and we're passing the salary of that object as well, and then we want to print the details. Now that we have the class, let's create an instance of the class. So let's create our first object, so employee1 equals, and the way you create it is just reference the class, and similar to when we call a function, we give it the parenthesis, and because we have to provide it a first name and last name to create an object, we'll pass it first name and last name. Now if we print employee1 and give that a run, so you can see that we have an employee object, and this is the address that is stored. So let's look at the difference between a class attribute, so the employee count, and an instance attribute, first name. Now a class attribute can be accessed through the class, so we can do employee count, and because it's shared with all the instances of the class, we can also access employee count through the instance, so the object employee1 employee count. So let's give that a run, and you can see that the employee count is 1, and it's printed out 1 again. Now what if we try to access the instance attribute? So let's give that a go. So let's do first name here and first name here. Let's call the employee1 after Let's give that a run. So you can see when we try to access first name through the object, so the instance of the class, we get Stacy back. But if we try to do that with employee, employee doesn't actually have that attribute in there. But to access this data, we have to have an instance of this class. Let's create another employee object, so employee 2. So now we have two objects. If we go and print employee 2's name as well and give that a run, so you can see that each object has its own data encapsulated within it. Object 1 has the first name Stacy and object 2 has this first name John. Now similarly we can also call the function employee 1 display details and employee 2 dot display details, and let's try employee dot display details. Let's give that a run. So you can see that displaying the details of employee 1 gives you Stacy Jones and the salary none, and when we display the details of employee 2 as we expect, we get Johnny Bravo and then salary none again. But if we do that with the employee class, it says we're missing a required positional argument. So what happens when we call display details from an instance? It passes a reference of the instance to this function as this parameter self, but with the employee class there is no instance, so we have to manually go and pass it an instance in there for it to work. So let's pass it employee 1 and give that a run. You can see now it actually prints out the details of employee 1. Now salary is none for both those objects, so let's go and set the salary for the employees. We can do that by setting the salary here when we instantiate the object, so let's say 30,000, or we can assign that value afterwards by doing employee 2 dot salary and then equals, and we'll pass it 30,000 here. Now if we give that a run, we can see both the employee 1 and employee 2 have the salary of 30,000. So that's a brief intro to classes and objects with Python. There are a few more things you can do with classes and objects, such as inheritance, and I'll be covering that in depth with my object-oriented programming video. To get a notification when I upload that video, just hit subscribe. Until then, as usual, if you have any questions, leave them down in the comments below, and I'll see you next time.